The Zeldar Dominion was ancient. It had existed for thousands of cycles, spanning 100 conquered worlds, and its power was absolute. No species had ever successfully resisted its rule. Some fought briefly, relying on primitive weapons or outdated tactics, but their civilizations always crumbled under the might of the Dominion's war machine. The Zeldar did not conquer out of hatred or cruelty. They saw themselves as the natural rulers of the galaxy, bringing order where chaos reigned. Their empire thrived because they understood war, and then they found Earth. At first, it seemed like just another planet, a fertile world teeming with sentient life, much like the others they had subjugated. The humans were an anomaly, however. They lacked the natural weapons of apex predators. Their bodies were fragile compared to other dominant species in the galaxy. They had no claws, no fangs, no venom. Their skin was soft, their bones weak, and their senses unimpressive. But something was wrong. Their history was filled with war, not just occasional conflicts over resources or territory, as was common among developing civilizations, but constant war. It was embedded in their culture, their language, their very way of life. The humans had been fighting since before they could even write. They had perfected violence over thousands of years, advancing from sharpened stones to mechanized slaughter in a fraction of the time it had taken other intelligent species to even leave their homeworlds. The Dominion's analysts were disturbed by what they found in the human archives. Every major technological advancement was driven by war. Firearms had evolved from crude, unreliable muskets to hyper-precise weapons capable of killing from miles away. Explosives had grown from simple gunpowder to devices that could annihilate entire cities in an instant. Their wars had begun with swords and arrows but had escalated into something that threatened not only their enemies but their own existence. Humans had twice brought themselves to the brink of extinction with weapons of their own making, and yet they continued. No other species was like this. Many conquered civilizations had known violence, but none had embraced it so completely. The Zeldar had always assumed that intelligence led to peace. Civilizations, as they grew more advanced, inevitably abandoned war in favor of diplomacy. But humans had done the opposite. They had refined war. Even when they had nothing to fight over, they created conflicts, ideological battles, simulated wars, even games designed to test combat skills. They celebrated war in their stories and trained for battle in times of peace. Even more concerning was their adaptability. Unlike other species, humans did not specialize in a single environment. They were not the fastest or the strongest, nor the most resilient, but they were everywhere, from scorching deserts to frozen tundras, from deep jungles to the highest mountain peaks. Humans survived. Thrive. If one method of hunting or fighting failed, they simply created a new one. They had mastered the art of making tools, but more importantly, they had mastered the art of using each other. They did not fight alone. Humans functioned in packs, but not like simple hive creatures. They formed bonds that went beyond mere survival. They created alliances, shared knowledge, and coordinated in ways that made them exponentially deadlier together than apart. Even worse, they had a concept entirely foreign to the Dominion's understanding of war: revenge. Zeldar warfare was precise, calculated. There was no emotion in it. They struck hard, crushed resistance, and moved on. But humans did not simply accept defeat. If an enemy struck them, they would not only retaliate, they would escalate. They would hunt down their enemies, destroy their homes, eliminate their leaders, and ensure that the lesson was never forgotten. A species that fought to win was dangerous, but a species that fought so that their enemy would never dare rise again, that was something else entirely. Still, the Dominion remained confident. They had technology far beyond anything humans possessed. Their energy weapons could reduce structures to ash. Their starships could wipe out entire cities from orbit. Their warriors were genetically enhanced, faster and stronger than any human could ever hope to be. This would not be a war. This would be an acquisition. And then the analysts came back with one final report. something that shook the Zelda High Command to its core. There was one human civilization that stood apart from the others, one that embodied everything terrifying about humanity but amplified beyond reason. A nation forged in rebellion, obsessed with personal freedom, and raised on the principle that no force, not even their own government, should ever have absolute power over them. The United States of America. At first, the Zelda believed this America was simply another nation, no different from the others. But as they dug deeper, the horrifying reality became clear. The Americans had built a society that thrived on conflict. Their history was filled with war after war, not just with foreign enemies but among themselves. They had fought the most advanced empires in history and won. They had faced existential threats and emerged stronger. More than any other nation on Earth, they had weaponized their own culture. Their entertainment glorified war, turning real battles into legends and legends into training manuals. Their civilians, ordinary farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, had access to military-grade weapons. Many of them trained not because they were required to, but because they enjoyed it. Some lived in constant preparation for war, stockpiling supplies and learning combat tactics for a conflict that had not even begun. And then there were the veterans. The Zelda had studied human soldiers and their tactics, expecting to find a structured, disciplined force similar to other military organizations in the galaxy. Instead, they found something far worse. The Americans did not simply train soldiers. They created warriors. They forged them in the most brutal conditions, sent them to conflicts across the world, and conditioned them to survive against impossible odds. And when their service ended, these men did not forget how to fight. They returned to their homes, blending into civilian life, but they remained predators in disguise. Some trained others. Some prepared for the next war. Some simply waited. The Dominion had conquered many planets, but never before had they faced a species that enjoyed war, a species that trained for it even in peacetime, a species that never truly disarmed. For the first time in their long history, the Zelda Dominion hesitated, and in the dark chambers of their war council, as their leaders reviewed the final invasion plans, one commander voiced a thought that had never before been spoken in the history of their empire. Perhaps this is a mistake. The Zelda Dominion had made its decision. Despite their analysts' warnings, despite the unsettling historical data, they moved forward with the invasion of Earth. The humans would fall like every species before them. Their strategy was simple: strike fast, eliminate resistance, and establish dominance before the humans could organize a proper defense. It had worked for centuries against lesser civilizations. The Dominion's warriors were superior in strength, endurance, and technology. They believed their energy weapons, shielded armor, and aerial superiority would make human resistance futile. They were wrong. The first wave of the invasion landed in multiple locations across the planet. High-priority targets included major population centers, government hubs, and strategic military installations. Most nations reacted in predictable ways. Some panicked. Some attempted diplomacy. Others mobilized their armies, but their weapons were too primitive to counter the Dominion's war machines. But in America, something different happened. The Zelda had expected resistance. They had not expected enthusiasm. The countryside hunts them first. The initial deployments in rural America were supposed to be routine. Dominion ground forces landed in small towns and remote areas, assuming these locations would be defenseless. Isolate the countryside, control the farmland, and then encircle the cities. A textbook strategy. But their first mistake was underestimating how armed the civilians were. Zelda patrols marched into small farming communities expecting submission. Instead, they encountered something their war doctrine had never prepared them for. Hunted men fight differently than soldiers. In Texas, the first scout team vanished entirely. Their last transmission contained garbled static, followed by a human voice speaking in an unfamiliar dialect. "You're done messed up." Days later, their bodies were found hanging from fence posts, stripped of their weapons and armor. The killers? ranchers, farmers, men who had grown up shooting rifles before they could even drive. They didn't fight like soldiers. They fought like predators. Further north, in the Appalachian Mountains, another squad went missing. When reinforcements arrived, they found the remains, skinned, gutted, and left as warnings. The Dominion did not know the term hillbilly, but they learned quickly. The Zeldar commanders were baffled. This wasn't how primitive species behaved. Civilians were supposed to flee. Instead, these humans were attacking with coordination, setting traps, and tracking their forces for miles before striking with no perfect precision. It got worse. Guerrilla warfare in the suburbs. Recognizing the countryside was a death trap, the Dominion shifted focus to the suburbs, assuming urban environments would favor their superior technology. Another mistake. Outside of Atlanta, a Zeldar platoon deployed to a seemingly quiet neighborhood. It was eerily silent. No civilians in sight. No gunfire. Just rows of identical houses, empty streets, and the faint hum of alien machinery. They advanced cautiously, their armor's energy field shimmering in the afternoon sun. Then, from the rooftops, from the alleyways, from the sills, they were attacked. The humans didn't fight in formation. They fought like insurgents. They fired from hidden positions, using weapons modified for armor penetration. They flanked from unexpected angles. Some had military training, but others were just regular people with hunting rifles, shotguns, and a terrifying level of patience. Dominion commanders issued orders to fall back, but retreat was impossible. The humans weren't just fighting. They were playing with them. As night fell, the remaining Zeldar troops took shelter inside an abandoned strip mall, thinking they could hold position until reinforcements arrived. Then the power cut out. A high-pitched, distorted sound filled the building, something from a human recording. "You ain't from round here, RYA." Then the shooting began. Only one Zeldar soldier survived the massacre. He was later found wandering the highway, muttering a single human phrase over and over: "They don't fight fair." Urban resistance turns into bloodsport. Frustrated, the Dominion committed more forces, launching direct assaults on major cities. This had worked before. Take out infrastructure, disrupt supply chains, force surrender. But once again, they misunderstood the enemy. The moment their dropships entered American airspace, they were hit, not by missiles, not by fighter jets, but by commercial drones. Hundreds of them, loaded with homemade explosives, launched by civilians who had repurposed their everyday technology into weapons. In Detroit, an entire occupation force disappeared overnight. The Dominion assumed a military counterattack, but satellite footage revealed something different. Zeldar soldiers being lured into abandoned buildings, never emerging again. They had walked straight into gang territory, and the locals had decided to make use of their new, heavily armed visitors. Chicago's South Side turned into a nightmare for the invaders. The Dominion deployed armored patrols, but the humans adapted quickly: Molotov cocktails, IEDs built from scrap, and coordinated ambushes from rooftops. The Zeldar commanders couldn't understand it. There was no central command, no structured resistance. But that was the terrifying part. The entire population was a resistance. Florida changes everything. The turning point came when the Dominion sent a division to Florida. Up until this point, they had believed they were dealing with organized militias, rogue military veterans, and survivalist groups. They had not yet encountered Florida Man. The Zeldar landed near Miami, expecting to seize control within hours. Instead, they were met by creatures that defied all logic. Humans who fought shirtless, barefoot, and wielding weapons that should not exist. They saw men throwing alligators at their soldiers. They saw a woman riding a motorized scooter into battle with a flamethrower. They saw gangs uniting, not for profit, but for the sheer fun of the fight. One Dominion officer, before being dragged into a swamp by a man covered in mud, sent a final message. They are not fighting to survive. They are fighting because they are bored. That's when the Dominion truly understood. The retreat begins. The invasion was failing, but not because the humans had better weapons, not because they had superior numbers, but because they enjoyed this. The Zeldar realized that they had made a fatal mistake. They had assumed war was something humans endured. It was not. War was something humans thrived in. The Dominion had landed on a planet that had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of killing. And among all humans, the Americans had refined it to a level that bordered on insanity. And so, the retreat began. The Zeldar forces withdrew from rural areas first, then the suburbs, then the cities. Within weeks, their entire invasion fleet was abandoning Earth. Not because they had been defeated in battle, but because they had seen what humans, what Americans, were truly capable of. And for the first time in the Dominion's history, they had encountered an enemy they feared. The Zeldar Dominion was retreating. Their invasion had failed, not because of superior human technology, but because they had awakened something primal, something terrifying. They had come expecting weak prey, a species that would surrender under the might of an interstellar empire. Instead, they had found something different. They had found apex predators. But the humans were not satisfied with merely surviving. They had been attacked. Their cities had been invaded. Their people had been taken. And Americans did not believe in just letting things go. The Zeldar had made a mistake, a critical, irredeemable mistake. They had left survivors. They had allowed Americans to witness their tactics, analyze their technology, and most of all, get angry. The retreat was not a victory. It was the beginning of a hunt. The first counterattack. The Dominion had assumed that withdrawing their forces from Earth would end the conflict. The humans would rebuild, they reasoned. They would take the loss and move on, as every species before them had. They could not have been more wrong. Just days after the Zeldar retreated to their orbital positions, the first counterstrike began. It started in space. The Zeldar had destroyed much of Earth's military infrastructure, assuming the planet would be unable to reach them. But they had overlooked something crucial: human resourcefulness. The Americans had improvised. Satellites, once used for weather tracking and GPS, were repurposed into makeshift kinetic bombardment weapons. Private space companies, once focused on exploration, were now launching experimental missiles loaded with repurposed nuclear warheads. Then, without warning, the first hijacked Zeldar starship launched an attack. The Dominion was stunned. How had humans taken one of their vessels? How had they even boarded it? They reviewed the recovered security footage. The answer made no sense. The humans had stolen it mid-flight. A private aerospace firm, run by what the Dominion had dismissed as billionaire lunatics, had tracked a low-altitude Dominion transport. They had calculated its trajectory. Then they had jumped onto it from a goddamn experimental spaceplane, using makeshift thrusters and duct tape. Once aboard, they had fought through the Zeldar crew using firearms, which should not have been effective in zero gravity. And yet, somehow, the humans made it work. They stormed the ship, slaughtered the crew, and piloted it back to Earth. Within hours, teams of American engineers had reverse-engineered the controls. Within days, they were using the stolen vessel to launch their own raids. And within weeks, humanity had its first functional war fleet, the Florida Experiment. Meanwhile, back on Earth, American scientists and military leaders were making another discovery, one that would change everything. The Zeldar had left behind bodies, captured Dominion corpses, broken weapons, destroyed armor. America's top minds dissected every piece of it. Where other nations focused on rebuilding, the Americans focused on understanding. What made the Zeldar strong? What made their ships fly? What powered their weapons? And, most importantly, what could make them stronger? The first real breakthrough came from Florida, because of course it did. A team of ex-military scientists, government engineers, and one very well-funded conspiracy theorist had been experimenting with Zeldar genetic samples. Their goal? To understand what made the aliens physically superior. The unintended result? They accidentally created the first human Zeldar hybrid soldier. What happened next is classified. All we know is that a few months later, an 8-foot-tall, half-alien, muscle-bound ex-Navy SEAL named Sergeant Gator was leading ground raids on Zeldar colonies. Witness accounts describe him as bulletproof, resistant to extreme radiation, and capable of ripping enemy soldiers in half with his bare hands. The hunt begins. By now, the war had changed. The Zeldar were no longer dealing with a primitive species, fighting a desperate resistance. They were dealing with something far worse. They were dealing with Americans on the offensive. Humanity had learned how to fight them, and they weren't following interstellar rules of engagement. They were playing by American rules. And American rules meant one thing: total war. The first large-scale counteroffensive began with the Battle of the Beltway, where the newly formed U.S. Space Corps launched a full-scale invasion of a Zeldar command station in orbit. The Dominion had never seen humans move like this before. Instead of orderly formations, they fought like insurgents in space, fast, unpredictable, and completely insane. Zeldar troops reported seeing spacesuited Marines using grappling hooks to board ships mid-flight. They watched in horror as a group of Texas National Guardsmen, who had never been to space before, commandeered a Zeldar battleship by flying a hijacked shuttle through its goddamn bridge window. Dominion commanders were paralyzed. Their forces were breaking. Then came the final blow. The Texas incident. The last true battle of the war didn't happen in space. It happened on Zeldar Prime, the Dominion's homeworld. The humans hadn't just stolen ships. They hadn't just learned how to fight in space. They had found out where the Zeldar lived, and Texas was pissed off. Nobody knows exactly how it happened. All we know is that one night, on a remote Dominion colony, a Zeldar security team picked up a strange radio signal. A voice, gravelly, deep, speaking in perfect English. "Howdy, boys. Mind if we join the party?" Then, before the Dominion could react, the entire colony went dark. Transmission logs recovered later confirmed the unthinkable. An American force, completely off the books, had infiltrated Dominion space using stolen ships. They had landed, and they had disappeared into the wild. For months, Zeldar Command received reports of something hunting their soldiers. Entire outposts were wiped out overnight. Warriors were found with their throats slit. Cities burned. And then, one day, a Dominion fleet intercepted a stolen Zeldar broadcast. It was video footage. A single, bearded man in sunglasses, standing in the ruins of a Zeldar city, holding up a Confederate flag in one hand and a pump-action shotgun in the other. The footage ended with a single phrase: "The South has risen again, motherfuckers." The Zeldar Dominion collapsed within weeks. The war wasn't just lost. It had become legend. Humanity had not only survived the invasion, they had won a place in the stars, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The Zeldar Dominion was gone, not merely defeated, erased. Once the mightiest empire in the known galaxy, they had ruled over dozens of planets, conquered countless species, and crushed resistance wherever it rose. But they had never encountered anything like humans. They had assumed Earth was just another primitive world, a minor conquest, a stepping stone to greater things. They were wrong. They had attacked humanity, but they had pissed off America. And now, the Zeldar homeworld was burning. The last stand of the Zeldar. On the ruins of their capital city, what remained of the Zeldar leadership gathered in a bunker beneath the surface. Once, this room had been a command center, a place where entire civilizations were doomed with a single word. Now, it was a tomb. Grand War Leader Zorvatek stood before his shattered council. He was one of the few survivors from the original invasion fleet, a veteran of 1,000 battles. He had once commanded armies. Now, he was left with fragments. "The humans are coming," one of his advisors whispered, voice filled with despair. "We must surrender," Zorvatek snarled, slamming his fist into the table. "To what?" he roared. We do not face an army. We do not face a strategy. We face madness. They have no high command, no central government directing this. They are a storm, a force of nature, sweeping through our worlds because they enjoy it. His voice faltered. The others knew he was right. Since their retreat from Earth, the humans had not stopped. They had followed the Dominion fleet across the stars, stealing ships, taking bases, hunting them down one planet at a time. And now, here they were, at Zeldar Prime. The last reports were already coming in. Entire battalions missing in the jungle regions. Zeldar cities going dark overnight. A fleet of stolen Dominion warships hovering over the capital like birds of prey, blasting everything that moved. And then, the sound began. A transmission, broadcast across every channel, on every screen, in every Zeldar city. A song, a deep, growling human voice. Some folks are born made to wave the flag. Ooh, they're red, white, and blue. The bunker fell silent. The humans had sent a warning. They weren't coming as conquerors. They weren't coming for territory. They were coming for vengeance. Then, as if the universe itself was mocking them, the room shook. The ground trembled. Zorvitek looked up, eyes wide. Something had landed. Then the door to the bunker exploded inward. Smoke, fire, screaming. And through the dust, silhouetted against the red glow of destruction, they walked in. The humans. Not in massive numbers. Not in neat formations. Just a handful of them. And somehow, that was more terrifying. The first was a massive, bearded man, shirtless, wearing nothing but cargo pants, boots, and a belt filled with knives. He had 2 cigars in his mouth at once and carried a minigun that should have been impossible for a single human to lift. The second was a woman, a scientist, maybe, glasses, lab coat, but her hands were covered in Zeldar blood, and she was holding a glowing vial, something taken from their own research labs. The third, he was different. He wore a cowboy hat, a long trench coat, and in his hands he held a double-barreled shotgun with the words Manifest Destiny carved into the stock. Zorvitek knew, in that moment, that the war was over. It wasn't about Earth anymore. It wasn't even about revenge. The humans had simply decided that they weren't done hunting yet. And so, with a slow exhale, the war leader closed his eyes and whispered, "May the stars forgive us." Then, he heard the last words he would ever hear. A deep voice, filled with cold amusement. "This is what happens when you mess with Texas." Then came the boom. Aftermath. Humanity, the apex species. The Zeldar Dominion was no more. The humans had not claimed their empire. They had not enslaved the survivors. They had simply left. Their message to the galaxy had been clear. Don't. Start. None. Won't. Be. None. But the galaxy did not forget. Across 1,000 civilizations, the legend of humanity spread. Whispers of the Earthborn hunters, of the American apex predators, who fought not for survival, not for conquest, but for sport. Diplomats from alien nations now spoke carefully when addressing humans. Border disputes vanished overnight whenever humans were involved. And every empire, every warlord, every species that had once looked at Earth with conquest in mind now understood one simple truth. Humanity was not to be challenged, not because of their numbers, not because of their weapons, but because war was their natural state. And America had perfected it. Epilogue, the warning. Deep within the archives of the Galactic Union, a recording was kept. A final message, recorded by the last Zeldar survivor. In it, a trembling alien voice whispered into the darkness. To those who come after us, if you find this, if you seek to claim the world called Earth, if you think its people are weak, remember our mistake, remember our downfall, and if you still do not believe, if you still think you are mighty enough to subjugate them, the voice faltered. Then, barely above a whisper, it uttered the final warning. Try invading Florida. Then the message cut to static. And no species ever dared challenge humanity again.